At 5:30 a.m., a thick fog covered the coastal town of Seabrook. Richard Carter, the owner of Carter's Market, stood at the bus station waiting for his son Ethan, who had been staying with Richard's younger brother while attending school in another town. Because of construction work at Ethan's school, 7th-grade students had been given a 3-day break. As the bus arrived, Ethan quickly spotted his father. "Dad!" Richard smiled and hugged him tightly. "Welcome home, buddy." The ride home was slow because of the heavy fog. Ethan laughed as he looked around. "It feels like we're driving through the clouds." When they reached home, Ethan's mother Sarah rushed outside and hugged him. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too, Mom." For a short while, everything felt perfect. But Richard's attention soon shifted back to business. "Ethan, would you mind checking on the store? Uncle Daniel says he'll be a little late this morning." "Sure, Dad," Ethan replied cheerfully. Sarah silently shook her head. Her son had just come home after weeks away, yet Richard was already thinking about the store. Still, she said nothing. A few minutes later, Ethan grabbed his bicycle and headed toward Carter's Market. As he disappeared into the thick morning fog, neither Richard nor Sarah realized they had just seen their son alive for the last time. At around 6:30 a.m., Ethan arrived at Carter's Market. The fog was still thick, making it difficult to see clearly down the street. The store was already open. Daniel Brooks, Richard's longtime employee and closest friend, had unlocked the shop earlier that morning. As Ethan approached, he spotted Daniel standing outside a nearby cafe with a cup of coffee in his hand. Ethan waved. "Hi, Uncle Daniel." Daniel looked up. For a second, he didn't recognize the boy through the fog. Then a smile spread across his face. "Ethan, you're home." "Just got here this morning," Ethan replied. "Look at you. You've grown since the last time I saw you." He laughed. Daniel knew how much Ethan loved chocolate, so he decided to surprise him. "Hang on a minute," he said. "Don't go anywhere." "Okay." Daniel quickly crossed the street toward a convenience store, planning to buy Ethan his favorite chocolate bar. Meanwhile, Ethan stepped inside Carter's Market. The familiar smell of groceries and wooden shelves immediately brought back memories. He slowly walked through the aisles, looking around with curiosity. Everything seemed exactly as he remembered. Eventually, he wandered toward the storage room at the back of the building. The room was dimly lit and filled with stacked boxes, old inventory, and supplies waiting to be placed on the shelves. Ethan enjoyed exploring places like this. As he looked around, something caught his attention. On one of the shelves sat a package of imported chocolate cookies. The packaging looked unusual compared to the local brands. Ethan picked it up and examined it. "Never seen these before," he said to himself. The cookies looked perfectly fine. Without giving it much thought, he opened the package. Crunch. The first cookie tasted surprisingly good. He ate another, and then another. Within a few minutes, several cookies were gone. Feeling satisfied, Ethan placed the package aside and smiled. He had no idea that those cookies had been sitting in the storage room for years. And he certainly had no idea that his life had just taken a tragic turn. Before leaving, Ethan grabbed a piece of paper and wrote a quick note. "Gone to play baseball with Jake." He left it on the counter where someone would easily find it. Then he jumped back onto his bicycle and rode away from the store. The morning still felt normal. The sun was beginning to break through the fog. Birds chirped in the distance. Everything looked peaceful. But hidden inside Ethan's body, a deadly chain of events had already begun. After leaving Carter's Market, Ethan rode his bicycle through the quiet streets of Seabrook. The morning fog was slowly disappearing as sunlight began shining through the clouds. Ethan felt happy to be home. He couldn't wait to spend the next few days with his friends and family. Holding his baseball glove under one arm, he pedaled toward the old playing field near the river, where he and his friends usually met on weekends. Meanwhile, back at home, Sarah was busy in the kitchen. She wanted to make Ethan's favorite lunch. After being away for so long, he deserved a special meal. As she cooked, she smiled to herself, imagining how excited Ethan would be when he saw the food waiting for him. Around 9 a.m., Sarah called Richard. "Have you seen Ethan?" "No," Richard replied casually. "He's probably having fun with his friends. Let him enjoy his break." Sarah nodded, though she wished Ethan would come home soon. Over at the playing field, Ethan's friends had already arrived. Jake looked around. "Has anyone seen Ethan?" The boys shook their heads. "He said he'd be here today," one of them replied. Jake checked the road again, expecting Ethan to appear at any moment. But he never did. The boys eventually started their game without him. As the morning passed, Sarah continued setting the table. Fresh pastries, sandwiches, Ethan's favorite snacks, everything was ready, but the chair across from her remained empty. Noon arrived, then 12:30. Still no Ethan. Sarah tried calling Richard again. This time there was no answer. Richard was busy at the store dealing with a large delivery and hadn't even looked at his phone. A feeling of unease slowly settled over Sarah. It wasn't panic yet, just a strange feeling she couldn't explain. Ethan was usually responsible. If he was going to be late, he would normally let someone know. Sarah walked to the front door and looked down the street. No bicycle. No Ethan. Only silence. For the first time that day, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right. And somewhere in Seabrook, Ethan was still missing. By early afternoon, Sarah's concern had started turning into fear. She had checked the street several times. She had looked in Ethan's room. She had even stepped outside to see if he was riding home. But there was still no sign of him. The lunch she had carefully prepared sat untouched on the dining table. The clock continued ticking. Every minute seemed longer than the last. At around 1 p.m., Sarah called Richard again. This time he didn't answer. She tried once more. Nothing. Frustrated and worried, she grabbed her jacket and headed toward Carter's Market. Maybe Ethan had returned to the store. Maybe Richard knew something she didn't. When she arrived, she stopped in surprise. The store was locked. The parking area was empty. There was no sign of Richard or Ethan. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. A nearby shopkeeper noticed her standing there. "Looking for Richard?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah replied. "And Ethan." "I saw Richard leave earlier. Said he was meeting someone across town." Sarah thanked him and slowly began walking home. Her mind raced with questions. Where is Ethan? Why hasn't anyone seen him? Why hasn't Richard answered his phone? As she walked, she passed a group of older men sitting outside a cafe. One of them was complaining loudly. "Those boys have been playing baseball near the river all morning. One of them is going to get hurt someday." Sarah immediately felt a little relief. The river field. That had to be where Ethan was. He was probably still playing with his friends. Maybe she was worrying for nothing. But even as she tried to convince herself, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. The streets suddenly seemed quieter. The afternoon felt strangely empty. When she reached home, she sat down and stared at the clock. The hours continued passing. No phone call, no message, no Ethan. And with every passing minute, the feeling in Sarah's heart grew heavier. Somewhere deep inside, a terrible fear was beginning to take shape. The afternoon slowly turned into evening. Sarah had spent hours pacing around the house, glancing at the clock every few minutes. The food she had prepared for Ethan was still sitting untouched on the dining table. By now, her worry had become impossible to hide. At around 6 p.m., she finally heard the sound of a vehicle stopping outside. Richard had returned home. The moment he stepped through the front door, Sarah rushed toward him. "Richard, I've been calling you all day!" Richard looked exhausted. "Sorry, I got caught up with work." "Work?" Sarah snapped. "Our son has been missing all day." The words hit Richard like a punch. He suddenly realized something that made his heart skip a beat. He hadn't seen Ethan since early that morning. "Wait," he said slowly. "He never came home?" Sarah shook her head. "No." For the first time that day, Richard felt a wave of panic. Just then, someone shouted from outside, "Richard!" Both of them turned toward the door. Standing outside was Daniel. One look at his face was enough to tell them that something was terribly wrong. Daniel was pale. His hands were trembling. He seemed to be struggling to speak. Richard quickly stepped outside. "What happened?" Daniel swallowed hard. For a few seconds, he couldn't get the words out. Then he finally spoke. "Richard, they found Ethan." The world seemed to stop. Richard stared at him. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "He was found near the river." Sarah gasped. "No." Daniel continued. "Some people spotted him in the water and pulled him out. They've taken him to Seabrook Medical Center." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard could hear his own heartbeat pounding inside his chest. Then suddenly Sarah burst into tears. "Ethan!" Without another word, Richard grabbed his keys. The couple rushed toward their vehicle. As they drove through the evening streets, neither of them said a word. Each was terrified of the same question. Was Ethan still alive? And somewhere ahead at Seabrook Medical Center, a truth was waiting for them. A truth that would change their lives forever. Richard drove as fast as he could through the streets of Seabrook. Beside him, Sarah sat silently, her hands trembling. Neither of them wanted to say what they were both thinking. The fear was too great. Within minutes, they arrived at Seabrook Medical Center. Several people from town were gathered outside the building. The sight immediately made Richard's heart sink. As soon as they stepped out of the car, familiar faces turned toward them. Some looked away. Others lowered their heads. Nobody seemed willing to meet their eyes. Sarah's breathing became uneven. "Where is Ethan?" she asked. No one answered. A few moments later, Dr. Michael Grant stepped out of the clinic. He had known the Carter family for years. Seeing the panic on their faces, he quickly walked toward them. "Please, come inside," he said. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Doctor, what happened to my son?" Dr. Grant hesitated for a moment. Then he forced a reassuring smile. "We're taking care of him. Let me show you." The doctor led them down a quiet hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. Finally, they reached a small treatment room. Sarah froze the moment she looked inside. Ethan was lying on a hospital bed. An oxygen mask covered his face. Several medical monitors surrounded him. He wasn't moving. "Ethan!" Sarah rushed to his side. She grabbed his hand. It felt cold, much colder than she expected. Tears streamed down her face. Richard stood near the doorway, unable to move. His mind refused to accept what he was seeing. Dr. Grant quietly watched them. Only he knew the terrible truth. By the time Ethan had been brought to the clinic, it was already too late. The boy had been gone for hours. But there was another problem. Richard had suffered a serious heart attack 2 years earlier. The doctor feared that shocking him with the truth immediately could trigger another medical emergency. So for now, he kept the truth to himself. Sarah looked up at him desperately. "Doctor, is he going to be okay?" Dr. Grant forced another calm expression. "He had difficulty breathing after being found in the water. We're doing everything we can." Sarah nodded, desperately holding on to those words. But deep inside, Dr. Grant felt a growing weight in his chest. Sooner or later, the family would have to learn the truth. And when that moment came, their lives would never be the same again. Night slowly settled over Seabrook. Inside the clinic, the hallways had become quiet. Most of the townspeople who had gathered earlier had already gone home, but Richard and Sarah refused to leave. Sarah sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand. Every few minutes she whispered prayers under her breath. "Please be okay. Please wake up." Richard sat outside the room in a plastic chair, staring at the floor. His mind replayed the events of the day again and again. The bus station, the ride home, the conversation at breakfast, the moment Ethan rode away on his bicycle. If only he had asked him to stay home. If only he had spent more time with him. The guilt was beginning to creep into his thoughts. Meanwhile, Dr. Michael Grant stood in his office reviewing Ethan's medical report once again. The results confirmed what he had already suspected. Ethan had not died from drowning alone. There was something else. Something that didn't make sense yet. The doctor rubbed his forehead and looked at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. Just then, Daniel arrived at the clinic. He had spent the entire evening helping organize the search and speaking with local authorities. When he entered the building, one of the town elders quietly pulled him aside. The older man lowered his voice. "Daniel, the doctor already knows." Daniel's face turned pale. "What do you mean?" The elder. Ethan was gone long before they found him. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The words felt impossible to accept. "Does Richard know?" he finally asked. The elder shook his head. "No. Dr. Grant wanted to be careful because of Richard's heart condition." Daniel looked toward the waiting area where Richard was sitting alone. How could anyone tell a father something like this? Slowly, Daniel walked toward him. As he approached, Richard looked up. The moment their eyes met, Richard noticed the expression on Daniel's face. The sadness, the helplessness, the grief. And suddenly, he understood. Before a single word was spoken, Richard knew. His son was gone. The world around him seemed to disappear. Without saying anything, he slowly stood up and walked toward Ethan's room. Behind him, Daniel lowered his head. Sometimes the truth didn't need words. The next morning, a heavy silence hung over the Carter family home. News of Ethan's death had spread throughout Seabrook. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and relatives began arriving early to pay their respects. Inside the house, Ethan's photograph stood on a table surrounded by flowers. Sarah sat nearby, unable to stop crying. Every corner of the house reminded her of her son. His laughter, his voice, his endless questions. Now, all of it was gone. Richard, on the other hand, sat quietly in a chair near the casket. He hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red, but no tears came anymore. The shock was too deep. People approached him throughout the morning. Some offered condolences, others shared memories of Ethan. Richard barely heard any of it. His mind felt numb. Around 10:30 a.m., the funeral service began. The small church was filled with mourners. Ethan had been loved by everyone who knew him. As the ceremony ended, Sarah broke down once again. Several relatives rushed to comfort her. Richard simply stood there, staring at his son's casket. It felt impossible to believe that only yesterday morning, Ethan had been laughing on the ride home from the bus station. Now he was saying goodbye forever. Later that afternoon, after the burial, the relatives slowly began leaving. The house became quiet again. Too quiet. For the first time since the tragedy, Richard found himself completely alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts were dark. Years earlier, a fortune teller named Ananda had told him something he had never forgotten. "Your son will face a great danger when he turns 12. The words echoed inside his head, again and again and again. As evening approached, Richard walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Inside was a bottle of whiskey. Without hesitation, he grabbed it. For the first time in years, he began drinking heavily. The pain inside him was unbearable. And before the night was over, that pain would turn into anger. As the evening grew darker, Richard continued drinking. 1 glass became 2. 2 became 5. Before long, the bottle was nearly empty. The alcohol dulled the pain for a while, but it couldn't erase it. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of Ethan. His bicycle outside, his baseball glove near the door, his favorite chair at the dining table. The memories felt like knives. Sarah had locked herself in her room, exhausted from crying all day. For the first time in years, the house felt completely broken. Richard stumbled to his feet and wandered through the living room. His eyes eventually landed on a small prayer shelf. There were several religious statues and framed pictures that Sarah kept there. Richard stared at them for a long moment. Then anger suddenly exploded inside him. "What good were any of you?" he shouted. His voice echoed through the empty house. "I prayed. Sarah prayed. We did everything we were supposed to do." His breathing grew heavier. "And still, my son died." In his grief and drunkenness, he grabbed a wooden stick that was leaning against the wall. With one violent swing, he knocked a statue onto the floor. It shattered into pieces. Another swing. A second statue broke. A framed picture crashed against the wall. Glass scattered across the floor. Richard stood there breathing heavily. But destroying the prayer shelf didn't make him feel better. If anything, it made him feel worse. A few minutes later, he staggered out of the house and into the cool night air. The streets of Seabrook were mostly empty. Richard walked aimlessly through town. His anger continued to grow. In his mind, someone had to be blamed. Fate, God, the world, anyone, everyone. As he wandered through the darkness, he eventually noticed a church near the town square. A stone statue stood outside under the streetlights. Richard stopped and stared at it. The alcohol clouded his judgment. The grief clouded everything else. Slowly, he bent down and picked up a rock from the ground. Then he raised his arm. Richard's hand trembled as he stared at the stone statue outside the church. The alcohol had blurred his thoughts, but his anger remained sharp. For a few seconds, he simply stood there. Then he threw the rock. Crack! The stone struck the statue's outstretched arm. A piece broke off and fell to the ground. The sound echoed through the quiet town square. Richard stared at the damage. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then the church door suddenly opened. The town's pastor stepped outside. "What happened?" he shouted. His eyes quickly found Richard standing nearby. Then he saw the broken statue. The pastor's face turned red with anger. "Richard, what have you done?" By now, several nearby residents had heard the noise and started gathering around the church. Within minutes, a small crowd formed. Some people were shocked. Others were furious. Richard remained where he was, swaying slightly from the alcohol. "My son is dead," he muttered. "My son is dead." But many people were too upset to listen. Someone called the police. As tensions rose, an elderly town leader named Mr. Harrison arrived. Despite being in his 80s, he was one of the most respected people in Seabrook. He quickly realized the situation could become much worse. Before anyone could start arguing, a police car pulled into the square. 2 officers stepped out. The pastor immediately walked toward them. "I want to file a complaint," he said angrily. He vandalized church property. The crowd began talking all at once. The situation was becoming chaotic. Mr. Harrison raised his hand. "Please," he said firmly. "Let's calm down." The crowd slowly grew quiet. Then he turned toward the pastor. "Richard lost his only child yesterday." The pastor's expression softened slightly. Mr. Harrison continued. "He's not acting out of hatred. He's acting out of grief." For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, a few church members stepped forward. One of them said quietly, "Richard has known people from every faith in this town for years. This isn't who he is." Others nodded in agreement. Gradually, the anger began to fade. After a long discussion, the pastor decided not to press charges. The police left. The crowd slowly dispersed. Richard eventually made his way home and collapsed into bed. He barely remembered what had happened. But the next morning, someone would reveal a truth far more painful than anything he had experienced so far. Richard woke up before sunrise. His head pounded from the alcohol, and his body felt exhausted. For a few moments, he simply sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. Then reality returned. Ethan was gone. The pain hit him all over again. Unable to stay inside the house, Richard stepped outside and wandered through the quiet streets of Seabrook. The town was still asleep. Eventually, he sat down on a wooden bench near a small park. The cool morning air felt heavy. A few minutes later, he noticed someone jogging toward him. It was Dr. Michael Grant. The doctor slowed down when he saw Richard. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Michael sat beside him. "I wasn't sure if I'd find you here," the doctor said quietly. Richard gave a tired smile. "I wasn't sure where I'd find myself either." For several seconds, silence hung between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "Everyone keeps telling me to accept it." Michael looked at him. "Accept what?" Richard stared at the ground. "That it was fate." The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. When he pulled out his hand, he was holding something small, a crumpled cookie wrapper. Michael handed it to Richard. "Take a look." Richard frowned. "What is this?" "It was found at your store." Confused, Richard examined it carefully. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then his eyes stopped on a printed date near one corner. His expression changed instantly. The expiration date read September 29th, 2022. Richard blinked, then looked again. Surely he was reading it wrong. But he wasn't. The cookies had expired years ago. His heart began beating faster. "Ethan ate these?" he asked. Michael nodded. A strange feeling suddenly settled inside Richard. Something wasn't right. Something about Ethan's death no longer made sense. And then another memory surfaced. Ethan had learned to swim when he was only 7 years old. He was actually a strong swimmer. Richard slowly looked up at the doctor. If Ethan knew how to swim. His voice trailed off. Michael met his eyes. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then the doctor finally broke the silence. That's exactly the question I've been asking myself. Richard stared at the wrapper in his hands. For the first time since Ethan's death, he felt something besides grief. He felt doubt. And deep down, he sensed that a terrible truth was about to come to light. Richard stared at the cookie wrapper in disbelief. His hands trembled slightly. The expiration date was impossible to ignore. For years, he had assumed Ethan's death was a tragic accident. Now, for the first time, he began to wonder if something else had happened. He looked at Dr. Michael Grant. "What are you trying to tell me?" The doctor took a deep breath. "I'm saying Ethan didn't simply drown." Richard's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Michael leaned forward. The medical report showed something unusual. Richard felt his stomach tighten. What did it show? The doctor paused before answering. Severe food poisoning. For a moment, Richard couldn't process the words. Food poisoning? Michael nodded. I saw Ethan earlier that morning. He looked perfectly healthy. According to the report, he became seriously ill not long afterward. Richard's mind immediately returned to the cookies. The expired cookies. The ones Ethan had eaten at the store. Michael continued. My best guess is that Ethan started feeling dizzy while he was walking near the river. Richard listened in silence. He may have gone there to wash his face or get some fresh air. The doctor's voice grew softer. But the poisoning likely became worse very quickly. Richard felt his chest tighten. Michael continued. He probably lost consciousness and fell into the water. The words hit Richard like a hammer. For several moments he couldn't speak. He remembered Ethan as a confident swimmer, a boy who had spent summers swimming in lakes and pools. Drowning never made sense. Now, for the first time, it did. The river hadn't killed Ethan. Something else had. Richard lowered his head into his hands. I told myself it was fate, he whispered. Michael remained quiet. Then he spoke carefully. Richard, I don't believe this was fate. Richard slowly looked up. The doctor held his gaze. I don't believe in fate. He paused. But I do believe in karma. Richard frowned. Karma? Michael nodded. Then he stood up from the bench. There are some things from the past that you need to remember. Without another word, the doctor began walking away. Richard remained seated. The cookie wrapper was still in his hand, and as he stared at it, memories from years ago slowly began returning. Memories he had buried long ago. Memories connected to a decision that would change everything. Richard sat frozen on the bench long after Dr. Michael Grant had left. The doctor's words echoed inside his mind. I believe in karma. Karma? Why would Michael say something like that? Richard looked down at the expired cookie wrapper again. Then, slowly, memories began surfacing. Memories from more than a decade ago. 2015. The year devastating floods struck several parts of the country. Entire neighborhoods were submerged. Thousands of families lost their homes. News channels covered the disaster day and night. People from around the world donated food, medicine, blankets, and emergency supplies to help the victims. Seabrook had also joined the relief effort. Because Carter's Market was one of the largest businesses in town, Richard had volunteered to help receive and organize some of the donated supplies. At the time, Dr. Michael Grant had also been involved. Medical organizations had shipped medicines and emergency supplies directly to his clinic. One particular shipment arrived from an international aid organization. Inside were boxes filled with food products, medicines, and emergency supplies intended for flood victims. Richard clearly remembered helping unload those boxes. He also remembered something else, something he had tried very hard to forget. As the supplies were being sorted, he noticed several imported food products that weren't available anywhere in Seabrook. Expensive cookies, chocolate bars, packaged snacks, items that could easily be sold for a profit. At first, he ignored the temptation, but the thought stayed with him. Nobody was carefully tracking every item. Nobody would know if a few boxes went missing. One decision led to another. Instead of forwarding every food item to the flood victims, Richard secretly set some of them aside. He told himself it wasn't a big deal. Just a few boxes, just a few products. He even convinced himself that someone else would make up for the shortage. The donations continued on their journey, and no one ever questioned what had disappeared. Over the years, Richard completely forgot about those hidden supplies. Until now. Suddenly, a terrible feeling began growing inside him. His breathing became heavier, because among the items he had hidden all those years ago, there had been several boxes of imported chocolate cookies, the exact kind Ethan had eaten. Richard's eyes widened. For the first time, he began to fear where these memories were leading. Richard's hands shook as the memory became clearer. The flood relief night, the stacked boxes, the temptation, and the decision he had made without thinking about the consequences. He had told himself it was harmless. Just a few boxes won't matter. But now those words felt like poison. Richard stood up abruptly from the bench and started walking without direction. The town around him felt unfamiliar, as if everything had changed overnight. But nothing had changed. Only he had. He returned to Carter's Market in a daze. The store was still closed at this hour. He unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside. Everything looked normal. Shelves neatly arranged, counters clean. But now every object inside felt heavy with meaning. He walked slowly toward the back storage room, the same room where Ethan had picked up the cookies. His heart pounded harder with every step. When he reached the shelves, he stopped. For a long moment, he just stared. Then he saw it. A small stack of old boxes pushed into the corner, dust-covered, forgotten. His breath caught. He knelt down and opened one of them. Inside were the same imported cookies, identical packaging, identical brand, the same batch he had hidden years ago. Richard felt his legs weaken. He sat down on the floor surrounded by the boxes. Suddenly everything connected. Ethan hadn't died by fate. He hadn't died by accident. He had eaten something that was never supposed to be there. Something his own father had secretly kept hidden for profit. Richard covered his face with his hands. "No, no, no!" His voice broke. All the grief he had carried for his son suddenly transformed into something heavier. Guilt. Not just for Ethan's death, but for the decision that had made it possible. Outside the store, morning light slowly began to spread across Seabrook. Inside, Richard sat in complete silence. And for the first time, he understood what Dr. Michael meant. This wasn't fate. This was consequence. This was karma. The morning light slowly filled Carter's Market. But inside the storage room, it felt like night never ended. Richard sat on the cold floor, surrounded by the old cookie boxes. His face was pale. His eyes were empty. Everything he had believed for the past few days, fate, accident, helplessness, had collapsed in front of him. Now only one truth remained. He was connected to Ethan's death, not by intention, but by action. A mistake made years ago, a choice buried and forgotten, and it had finally come back. Richard picked up one cookie packet with shaking hands. The same brand, the same expiry date, the same silent warning he had ignored long ago. He whispered to himself, almost unable to hear his own voice. "I didn't mean this." But the truth didn't care about intention, only consequence. Outside, the town of Seabrook was waking up. Birds chirped, people walked to work, life continued as if nothing had happened. But inside Richard's world, everything had ended. He remembered Ethan's smile at the bus station, his laugh in the fog, the way he had said, "It feels like we're driving through the clouds." Richard closed his eyes tightly. A wave of pain hit him so hard he almost collapsed. At that moment, Dr. Michael Grant entered the store. He stopped when he saw Richard sitting there. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at him. Then he walked closer. "You found it," Michael said quietly. Richard nodded slowly. His voice was barely a whisper. "It was me." Michael didn't interrupt. Richard continued, broken. "I kept those boxes. I forgot everything." Silence filled the room. Then Michael spoke. "You didn't forget, Richard." Richard looked up. "You chose not to remember." The words struck harder than anything before. Michael continued softly. "And that's what karma is." Richard's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't blame fate. He didn't blame God. He didn't blame the world. He only looked at the boxes, at his past, at his mistake. Somewhere far away, Sarah sat alone in Ethan's room, holding his photograph close to her chest. In another part of town, life moved on. But for Richard Carter, life had already stopped. Not the moment Ethan died, but the moment he made a choice years ago and forgot it. Richard slowly stood up. He placed the cookie packet back into the box. Then he closed the lid. Not to hide it, but to accept it. And in the silence of the storage room, one truth remained forever written into his life. Some mistakes don't disappear. They wait. And one day, they return as karma.